Welcome back to the Rooftop Recording home recording series. Today, we're going to look at the mixing and processing of the drum tracks we did in videos 1 through 3. If you remember, we did single drum mic in a number of different positions. Then we did 2 mics, both as a stereo set and also as an overhead and kick drum. And then moved on to 4 mics and 6 mics, and finally my full drum miking setup, or one rendition of it. And we're going to take a look at all of those over the next 2 videos. But first of all, just a quick note about these processes. What I'm showing you today are sort of some general approaches and starting spots that I might use. There's no way to know how drums are going to mix into a track without the rest of the elements: guitars, bass, vocals, keyboards, reverbs. Everything that you might put into the creation of your music is going to affect the way that you process the drums. So these are not definitive. These are not the only way that I would process these. It's just some things to think about. If you have things that you like to do that I missed, if you have ideas that this spurs for you, leave notes about it in the comments below. Be sure to click the notification bell and subscribe to my channel. It really helps out with getting these messages out to the world. And share this with your friends if you enjoyed it, and thank you for tuning in. Without any further ado, we're going to get right into that first drum track, which was the single drum mic. If you remember, we did a 57, a large diaphragm condenser, and then also a ribbon mic. And for a single drum mic, the one that was most appealing to me is the ribbon. So we're going to look at that first from over the shoulder on the floor tom side, and then secondly out front, sort of at a close room mic position, and process those. I'm going to give you both what I would do with stock Pro Tools plugins and then a couple of more deluxe plugins that are more likely what I would actually use if I was processing this in a track. Lots of different ways to do this, and lots of different plugins and tools that could be used and that I might use at any given time. I also have hardware that I might use to process these drum tracks. That I'm going to avoid. I'm going to stick with everything on screen so that you can see what I'm doing, and something that you might be able to emulate in your own process. So here we go, the first drum track, single overhead. All right, so this was the over the shoulder, and I'm going to play you just a little bit of this track out front, and I'll get the loop off, and let's hear a little bit of that first track, unprocessed. Okay, so really pretty fine sounding all in all. The drums sound good, no weird rings, no problems to deal with, just drum sound. So a couple of things. I have pulled up an EQ3 7-band and the Dyne 3 compressor. These are the basic third rendition Pro Tools included plugins. And just very quickly what I would do on a single mic. What I heard listening to that track was the bass drum was lacking a little bit of definition. It was a little bit of sort of separate and distant sounding, and I want something a little more energetic and exciting. I want to bring that power of the drums out and make it as strong as possible. So a couple of things. 25 hertz high-pass filter that I've put on. That's the first thing. So just about any speaker that you're going to play this on, there is no frequency response under 25 hertz. There's probably not frequency response up to 35 or 50 or 100 hertz. Yamaha NS10s were the studio standard for decades, well, more than a decade anyway, and they almost don't respond under 100 hertz. But under 25, you're not losing anything, but you are gaining energy. If you're trying to drive a speaker at 15 hertz, just that low rumble, all that's doing is taking away energy from the amplifier and that speaker and trying to move it in a way that's not producing musical sound. So we can filter that out. There's nothing lost. Now, if you're playing that in a large club system with subwoofers, you might hear a difference, that it's going to be more clear with it on. Headphones, earbuds, basic studio speakers, you're probably not going to even hear that. But trust me, it saves some energy. Now, I do want a little more power and body out of that bottom end, though, which the second EQ move I made was boosting 88 hertz. Now, I won't always go that high with a low frequency boost for the kick drum, but we only have the kick drum by way of the overhead. It's not the most efficient way to get a kick drum sound, but this is going to do quite a bit to beef that kick drum up. It really helps that floor tone too. So there's a lot of power now in that kick drum, but what I'm not getting is the definition and the sort of slappy attack on the top. So my high mid-range here, there's a tried and true technique of boosting a frequency and sweeping it around. So I set this by boosting it quite severely and moving it until I heard, yeah, that's where I'm hearing the kick drum. So we'll start, 1.5, 1.4, and I'm just gonna sweep it through, and you'll hear, I think right around 3K, that kick drum really is the thing that's standing out more than the other elements. All right, so yeah, it got a little harsh on both sides, but the 3K actually sounded good. That added something that I really liked. So we'll pull that back down just about 3.5, 4 dB and a really narrow boost. Just giving some front edge to that kick, a little bit. And then final thing, ribbon microphones, they don't have a whole lot of high end. They're pretty dark sounding, and I want the cymbals to shimmer. So I'm going to add quite a bit of high end. The ribbon mics, one of the reasons I really like them is they accept that EQ really nicely. They don't get harsh in the top end. It just lets you bring it back, and it still stays nice and silky and smooth. So here we go. Yeah, even at 12 dB, it's not that bad. I'm not going to boost it that much, but 5, 6, 7 dB of real high-end boost at 8.5K, that's not going to be a problem for this. It sounds really nice. It adds that air and openness. Ribbons have all the detail of a condenser microphone. It's just a very different kind of detail, and can be great for drums just for that reason of really getting the shimmer and not being harsh. So there's a treatment for that. Now for the compressor, there's a couple of different settings that I like to use, and I'm going to show you those. Okay, so compression. There's two ways that I generally treat drums, and one is sort of smoother and subtler, where I'm just bringing up some of the body and some of the fullness and the detail. And then the other one is a much more harder, aggressive sort of compressor sound. So I've got two presets that I created, and one is smooth drums. Now, to be honest, I don't use this compressor. I created these for this video just so you had an idea of what you could do if all you've got is your stock compression plugins. So this has a knee control, which lets me really soften up that transition between natural uncompressed drum sound and limited. So I'm keeping that knee very, very smooth and a fairly long attack, 30 milliseconds, and a fairly fast release. This is going to make for a pretty subtle sort of compression tone. So I'm just going to show you what this does, and then we'll go to the other preset. One note, though, that I did want to go over first, this also has this beautiful function of a high pass and low pass filter, or low filter and high filter, depending which way you term it. And I'm going to start with it off, and then I'm going to turn the filter on, and what you'll notice is the kick drum is no longer triggering the compressor, so the kick drum is free to come through. It's going to let a lot more power out of that kick. It's a really nice feature, and some of my very favorite compressors have that. So here we go. Uncompressed. And then here's the high pass filter. So that's my sort of smooth compressor setting. Now with that high pass filter engaged and all of those settings, I'm going to let you hear it on and off again, and then I'm going to go to my more aggressive sound. Now, while I'm switching this over here, one thing to remember about compression is when you're in a loud environment, a loud rock band playing hard, your ear has a muscle that contracts and constricts the sound getting into your ear canal. And that constriction of your ear canal works exactly like a compressor. So a compressor is a tool we're using to recreate what happens when we're in a loud, exciting environment. So if you're working on a track that's supposed to feel loud and exciting and energetic, compression on drums is almost a necessity. Plus, guitar tracks and bass tracks, even vocal tracks, have a pretty narrow dynamic range, whereas a drum set, from ghost notes on a cymbal or brushes to a snare being hit, quite hard, that's a wide dynamic range. Percussion tends to have some of the widest dynamics in a production, and everything else is significantly less. So the compressor on the drums is bringing that in to the same sort of range where it's going to hold its position in sort of the fundamental keeping of that track, leveling it out. So this setting is what I had created for my harder, more aggressive sort of sound. If I really want a rock track and want it to pump, this is the sort of compressor setting I'm going to more use. A little faster attack, a pretty fast release, and a harder knee, a much harder knee, still using the high pass filter. Everything else very similar, but harder knee, faster attack, faster release, and it's really going to be pretty hard hitting. Without it. Now I also may take something like that and slow the attack down a little more, speed the release up, and then drop the threshold a little more and get even more of that really hyped drum sound. Yeah, so the fastest compressors, something like an 1176, maybe a lot faster than that, where you're measuring attack in picoseconds. I think 20 picoseconds is the sort of range of what a 1176 does. And we're a lot slower than that. So anyway, that's sort of the two general approaches I would use to compressing drums. Now, in an actual recording, I wouldn't be using the built-in. I would be using something a little more deluxe. So there's a couple that I picked out for this example. A 660 Fairchild compressor is a hardware compressor. It's one of the holy grail pieces, and this is a really great emulation. It's quite slow and gentle, but at the same time, it has a really nice character and shine to it. This model has a sidechain filter. It has 6 different attack and release settings, which are from this time constant, true to the original hardware. One is the fastest, still not very fast. And that goes all the way to number 6, which is a program-dependent setting. So fast transients, it's going to be a little faster on, and overall program material, it's going to be very slow and gentle. 5 and 6 are program-dependent, and I think maybe 4 is as well. And then 1 through 3 are just straight attack and release times. I tend to use 1 and 2 mostly for drums. I tend to use the later ones when I put it on a mix bus or a master bus. So anyway, here's setting number 1 for that. And then for the EQ, I'm using this Helios channel strip. Helios made the consoles that were used on a lot of Led Zeppelin recordings, the famous mobile truck of the 1960s and 70s, which the Rolling Stones recorded all of their American recorded albums on, and just about every live album of the 60s and 70s, Frampton Comes Alive, I'm pretty sure, was all recorded in the same mobile truck, and that truck had a Helios console. So you've heard Helios a bunch of times, although their name is not quite as well known as some other people. And I boosted the top end, I've got an upper mid-range peak, which is going to give that smack and slap on the kick drum and a little bit with the other drums and the toms. And then I'm lifting 60 hertz at the bottom, just a gentle low frequency boost. There is not a high pass filter on this, and in application of a session, what I would do probably is use a separate plugin just to give a little bit of a high pass. So I am going to leave that on. And I just want you to hear the difference that this makes in that first example. There's nothing for plugins. So that all works pretty well. Now, we also had the single mic out front in the sort of close room mic position. And what I noticed in that is there's a lot more low end. The low end of the kick drum does not need to be hyped. So just a few different EQ colorings with this. The compressor settings also could potentially change. Let's hear what that front mic sounded like through this same signal path. Now, I might actually slow this compressor down a little bit. I'm hearing a lot of room and not as much attack on the drum. So a slower attack from the compressor is going to allow the drum attack to come through more. So again, program material and what the drum sounds like originally is really important, and you're going to have to listen to that and think about it when you're actually processing your tracks. But there's a couple of ideas. So from there, let's move on to the dual mic setup. So I had a couple of different approaches to this. One, we need to activate these tracks. Make active. We can hide this guy away. Thank you very much. So we did stereo overheads, again, from sort of the floor tom side behind the drummer, front Bloomline pair, which should be very similar to what we just had with the room mics, and then a single overhead and kick mic. So let's start with that single overhead and kick. Now, it's the same sets of effects. So we're just going to jump right to these more deluxe plugins for the overhead. This should sound very much like what we just had. Now, you'll notice there's not anywhere near as much low end, and I did take the 60 hertz bump off. I may not keep that, but we don't need the kick drum because we're going to add that with its own mic. The question for me is what's going on with the floor tom. If we need that low end on the floor tom, I'm going to bring that back in. Yeah, let's see. There's a fill here. I don't know that we need it, and I don't like what it's doing to the snare drum to have that added in. I like the better clarity without that low frequency bump. So let's put that kick drum on. Now for the kick drum, what I came up with, so on that kick drum, the API 550, I like it's a nice solid EQ, and it lets me really find that peak frequency, and I've got a sharp boost. This is what's called a proportional Q equalizer. So When it's a gentle boost, it's very wide. And then the more boost it gets, the narrower it gets until it's a real point. And this lets me really bring that point of the attack of the kick drum out. I've rolled some high end off, rolled some mid-range out, and then brought in some extra low frequency bump on the bottom. And that one's fairly wide. Let's listen to that kick drum first without the EQ. This is just that one mic. There's where I brought in with the EQ. So then with the overhead, so that's very similar to what we had with the single overhead, but the kick has got a lot better definition just from putting a mic directly on the kick drum. So going back to the stereo tracks, this is going to be very similar processing to what we did before. As a matter of fact, I do believe I copied the settings from mono into stereo and used exactly the same settings. Yep, there's the hard compression and our same EQ. Oops. Same EQ on the overhead. Let's hear that. Okay, really totally fine. I did tweak the compressor settings just a little bit. It's always a matter of listening. And with the Helios and the Fairchild, let's see what we've got here. It sounds all right, but I am missing the definition of having that kick drum. Let's see how that front bloom line is. Now, I had slowed the compressor down before, so let's see if the same thing holds true here with the stereo miking. Yeah, that actually sounds better to me from the front with the stereo track. So that's three different approaches that you could use with stereo miking for the entire drum kit. We're getting to something more usable, a little more professional. And then I would call this the final of the minimal drum miking. This is 4 mics. So we take the stereo overheads and the kick drum mic and a snare drum mic. So we've got the full stereo range from that overhead configuration. And this was a more traditional right over the sort of center of the drum kit for the stereo mics and kick and snare. So let's listen to that snare drum by itself and take a look at what I dialed up for that. Oops. All right, so stereo overheads, kick, snare, and then we have the Glenn Johns placement of those overheads with the same thing. And for this, what I had dialed up was a Pro Q, and I'm going to show you why I use that in just a minute, and then the Neve 1073. The snare drum track first without either of these plugins. All right, what I hear there is doink, 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 doink. There's that real ring after every hit. That drives me crazy. Some drummers want some of that ring. Some drummers want a lot of that ring. Me, I don't want it. I want very little. So this Pro Q from FabFilter, there are a number of plugins that are dynamic EQs or EQs that have spectrum analyzers in them. There's a free one from Voxengo, Span. And if you don't have an EQ with a spectrum analyzer, you can download this analyzer for free. And then if I have that snare soloed up, you can see we've got some bands here which are pretty loud compared to the rest of the drum sound. That's the ring that we're looking for. Now, the Fab filter, I think, does an even better job of displaying it. It's a much faster response. If you hover in the area in the bottom, it actually shows you where they are. But you can see this long ringing sustain down here. That's a lower one, but if I take an EQ really narrow, and a lot of times what I'll do is make it very narrow and then boost it. Now as I sweep it around, you'll hear it sort of sing. Right there. That is one of the frequencies. So then I'll take that down. There it is. Now, the other option that you've got, boom, boom. I have a piano close by, and it's really useful for that. It's a D. I also keep a chart, which, if you'd like, I'll email to you. For frequency ranges, frequencies by note. So a D is going to be 587.3 hertz. So we're at 547, so I'm going to take that up to 587 and see if that helps me narrow in on that bong, bong that I keep hearing. Yeah, let's do it this way. 587.33. That's it. Now those two are the frequencies that were really driving me crazy. So with this Fab Filter Pro Q, I can just dial that bit of ring out, and then the snare drum sounds great. Without. And there you go. Really useful. Now, the Neve 1073, this is a great EQ for snare drums and a lot of things. Warm Audio makes a nice hardware version that's not tremendously expensive. BAE is another company that makes a fabulous hardware version. The original hardware will cost you somewhere in the vicinity of $10,000 for a single channel, but the Warm Audio you can have for under $1,000 for a single channel with EQ. And this really nice for bringing that snap out on the top. The top frequency at 7.2, the high frequency band, and then also some beef and thickness on the bottom, which for me is usually at either 110 or 220 hertz. And then I'll also put this high pass filter on with the snare drum as well. I don't want any bass drum bleed clouding up my low end, and there's not that much deep low end in a snare drum. So here's without that, and then I'll turn it on. Without. Now those two frequencies on this 1073 also start to bring some of the rattle of the bottom snare in, even though I didn't have a bottom snare mic, so it's very useful for that. Now here's the whole drum kit with the kick and overheads as we had treated them before, adding in that snare drum. Now, with so much of the definition from that kick and snare, this is where I would probably start adding in some reverb, probably a small room sort of reverb, or I can crank the compression harder on the overhead and see if there's some natural reverb to get in. I'm gonna go with that faster attack and release again. And yeah, we can hear a little more room ambience now. Without it. Yeah, I like that really hyped overhead sound, especially in a more minimally mic'd drum situation. That's pretty usable. I could probably work that into an album, and as long as it wasn't too much of a drum feature, I think that would totally work. Glenn Johns overhead, a little bit different stereo image. Let's hear what we've got there. All right, so I do actually hear a bit of a problem and a flaw on this one. Now, Glenn Johns is one mic sort of over the snare and the rack tom, and the other mic just off the floor tom pointing in towards the bass drum. And that floor tom mic, I think, is too close to the floor tom and getting a lot of the kind of low rumble off of that floor tom. So this is another spot where using that FabFilter Pro Q really can come in handy. So we should see here, now I'm actually gonna split this. There's a command in Pro Tools, if you right click on the track, split into mono. Now I've got a separate left and right overhead, and I'm going to see there it is. So let's look, I'm gonna put the Pro Q, and we'll do a quick reset. So I'm going to solo this up and look at this track and see if I can see where that low frequency rumble is coming exactly in. Oh yeah, look at that. Big rumbly bottom right there. So funny thing is, that frequency is not what came out when it was hit, but the Pro Q is a dynamic EQ, which means I can pull that down, except when it's being hit, and then create this boost that'll bring it back up. And there's a threshold control. Now, when I bring the threshold control up a little bit, it's not even moving. So I think it's okay to just leave that as a cut. We can keep it fairly narrow and not 27 decibels on it. There we go. Rumble off that floor tom is gone, and the floor tom still sounds fine. Let's listen to that whole piece again. All right, that's working for me. So a 6 drum mic setup is not so much of a minimal sort of drum setup. It's pretty complete. A lot of albums were made with less microphones than that, and they sound great. But this adds to a traditional stereo overhead. Now I'm gonna get rid of this split track. Okay, so we've got stereo overhead, kick, snare, and then a rack tom and a floor tom. Wow, plenty of power from those toms, maybe too much. So the other thing I notice is, again, we've got that sort of howly rumble from the toms. I'm going to solo up just the tom mics and show you what I mean. This is the element of putting a mic right on the tom, which can be problematic. That's just ugly rumble. Great once the drums are being hit, but all of that stuff in between is really unnecessary. So there's a feature I love in Pro Tools that I use for this. It's called strip silence. Apple U on a Mac computer will pull it right up. And when you highlight a section, it has a threshold. This is basically a gate that you get to control a little more accurately than a gate. So the threshold is what volume is it going to separate out and delete that track. So you'll notice it started with a lot of clips kind of hanging out. And as I bring this threshold up, it's left with only the tom hits. But let me zoom in here. That is cutting off all the tail. And I'm not sure if it actually got the first transient in. So we're going to use the clip start pad and move that back just sometime after the next drum hit in front of it, but enough to make sure that we get that attack. So 123 milliseconds. And then likewise at the end, I can see where that tail tapers off. And here's the next snare hit. So I'm going to take that almost up to that snare hit and maybe even a little past the snare hit. And I'm going to click strip, which is going to remove anything from that track except for this fade section, which was outside of those parameters. And you'll see now we have only hits. I can usually, while these are still highlighted, Apple F, which will bring you into the fade dialog, fades, create fades, Apple F. And here we padded 123 milliseconds, so let's go 110 milliseconds of fade in time. And we did 1200, so let's do 1050 of fade out time. Now we can also adjust our shape. I've got an S curve for my tail out. I've got a pretty aggressive inward slope, which I'm going to change the opposite way to be a logarithmic slope in. And when I click OK, it automatically creates fades. And now we have this beautifully cleaned tom part. Now, the second drum may or may not be able to stand the same exact settings. We don't know. You may have to adjust the threshold a little bit. Looks pretty good to me. And the amount of time padding is fine. That seems to get all the tail. And I'm going to strip that out. Apple F for fades. Same settings are still in place, so create those. Now, nice, clean tom track. So that is going to blend in really nicely. And that howl is gone. Okay, so definitely time with all these tight mics and all of that definition to get a little more reverb going. That's on the first setting. So we've got a little bit of the natural room coming in through the overheads. So for me to add a reverb, highlight all these tracks, click the first, hold shift, click the last. Now I add the command button, that's the option button. And I'm going to send all of these to reverb. If you don't have it already named in your bus dialog, you can select a numbered bus and then go into setup, IO, busing, and name any of these pairs. But I have one set up for reverb, so that works just fine. And then I need to create a new track, which is going to be a stereo auxiliary input, and I'm going to call it Verb. Very creative. I actually have saved a preset, which is reverb. Presets are great. You don't have to go through populating your plugins. You can have it pre-loading everything that you may want on that. And there we go. It already has verb set up as its input, and I've got a couple of reverbs plugged in here. There are other ones that I use, but the Abbey Road chambers I really like for drums. As a matter of fact, I created my own drum chamber program and a big drum chamber. But let's just go for the standard chamber at first and hear what we've got. Now, there is a problem with this. I see one microphone, which means for some reason this was populated as a mono plugin. So we're going to switch this to multi-channel reverb. I'm going to need to update my preset there. And again, I'm just going to load Dave Chamber. Actually, looks like it already was. And now we've got 3 mics for a stereo array. And I also use a filter. Oops, that is not a filter. That's another reverb. The filter, there is a filter built into that particular reverb, but the Renaissance EQ, you can use any EQ for this, but I have a preset in the Renaissance EQ reverb filter, which is going to take away some low end that I don't need, take away some really shimmery high end that I don't need, and focus it in the mid-range. I'm going to start with that off. I've got the reverb set and sent, and I'm going to start with just putting that reverb on the overhead. Here's about it. Now, I'm also probably going to put a little bit of that reverb, not quite as much, on the direct snare and toms. Those toms to me feel a little bit big and a little bit loud. I'm going to use an API 550 for those. I really like this as a drum EQ in general. I'm going to add a little bit of high end. I'm going to take a little bit of low end out, starting around 100 hertz. Just filter that out as a low shelf. Gently, just a couple of dB. And I'll leave that 500 scoop, that lower mid-range scoop out. And I might have to play around with this mid-range boost to see. I'm going to soften it up some. Start at 3K. I've got another gentle boost at 5K, just lifting some top end. That's for the rack tom. For the floor tom, lifting a little 5K. I'm going to move that up to 7K. Leave that at 3. And I don't know that this is the right setting, but it's a place to start. So you got to start somewhere. And then I'm going to bring the volume on those down just a little bit as well. And let's see how this sounds. Now that reverb filter, I'm going to turn that on and then back off and then back on so you can hear what's going on with that. Here's without the filter. Here's turning the filter on. I'm going to hype the reverb a little more so you can get a better sense of this. Here's without it. With. So that filter sort of constrains the reverb into that mid-range where it's thickening a little bit and making it a little bit beefier. And I actually could, if I wanted, put more reverb on with the filter because it's not quite as spacious and getting in the way of the power in the bottom and the crisp definition in the top. It's just sort of warming the mid-range up, which is what we really want from putting that reverb on there. But this is a pretty good sounding drum recording. I could make a record with that. No problem and no doubt. And those toms sound better. That's fine. Now, in the sake of a real recording, I would be tweaking all these EQ settings and making sure that they line up with the guitars and they leave the right sort of EQ room for other elements to come in. I can't do that in this situation. I did just post an entire mix breakdown, and I'll do another one where I'm using acoustic drums and show a little bit of how I do that balancing of the spectral range between instruments. But in this case, this should show you what I'm hoping you'll be able to get out of it. And we're going to make this video a little bit shorter, and then I'm going to make a second video, a follow-up, where I do the treatment on the full drum kit. There's a lot to go through with like 13, 14 channels of microphones on the full drum miking that I would normally use on a session. So I will have that video up and posted very soon. Be sure to click subscribe so that you can find out exactly when that is posted and published. Should be in the next couple of days. Thanks much for watching. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next video.